Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about an interesting sight that many people may have encountered in the Kangeo area, especially along the Longtau River. You might have seen an oil tanker seemingly small but moving at a surprisingly high speed. This may come as a surprise since oil tankers are not designed to go fast. They are known for their massive size, heavy loads, and cautious navigation to ensure absolute safety. So why, on such a critical waterway that connects the East Sea to major ports like Cat Lai and Hiep Phuoc in Ho Chi Minh City, do we sometimes see a vessel like that traveling at such high speed?
You know, I was down in Kangeo recently watching ships on the Longtau River, and this oil tanker went by. And it just seemed, well, surprisingly fast. You sort of picture them as these really slow, lumbering giants, right?
Yeah.
So it got me thinking, why would an oil tanker look like it's speeding?
Yeah, that's a great observation.
Yeah.
And it really gets to the core of what we want to unpack today.
Okay.
We're going to do a deep dive into exactly that, why a tanker might seem fast, especially somewhere like the Longtau. There are actually quite a few reasons it could happen.
Right. So maybe let's start with the basics for anyone listening. Oil tankers,
Right.
What are we talking about exactly? Huge ships, obviously designed for liquids.
Exactly. Specialized vessels built to transport massive quantities of liquid cargo, usually either crude oil, straight from the
For
ground
refinery.
to the refinery, yes, or product takers carrying the finished stuff, gasoline, jet fuel, things like that, out to where it's needed.
And they're not just giant bathtubs full of oil, are they? They have compartments.
Oh, absolutely. For safety and stability, the cargo area is divided into multiple separate tanks. It's quite sophisticated.
Okay. So back to the speed thing. Why might one seem quick? You mentioned several factors.
Well, probably the biggest single factor, often, is how much cargo it's actually carrying, or perhaps how much it isn't carrying.
Ah, so an empty or lightly loaded tanker behaves differently.
Completely differently. Yeah. When there's little or no cargo, the ship's total weight is massively reduced.
Okay.
So it floats much, much higher in the water. Its draft, how deep it sits, is less.
And less ship in the water means less drag.
Precisely. Think about the wetted surface area, the part of the hull actually touching the water. Reducing the draft, even significantly, drastically cuts down that area and therefore reduces the friction, the water resistance.
Right.
It's like the ship suddenly becomes, slipperier. The engines can achieve higher speeds much more easily. You take a VLCC, a very large crude carrier.
Huge thing.
Massive, 3 football fields long, roughly. When it's empty, running in ballast, it might travel up to, say, 1.5 times faster than when it's fully loaded.
Wow, okay, 1.5 times faster. That's a significant difference. So being empty is a big one. What about the river itself? The Longtau tides must be a major player there.
Oh, absolutely crucial. For ships this large, navigating a tidal river like the Longtau often hinges entirely on hitting the high tide.
Why high tide specifically? Just needing deeper water.
Exactly. They need sufficient water depth under the keel, enough clearance to avoid running aground. That's obviously a huge risk.
Yeah, you don't want that.
Definitely not. So if a tanker is, say, arriving a bit early for the high tide window or maybe running a little late, the captain might decide to increase speed slightly to make sure they get into the channel or up to the port during that optimal high water period. Missing it could mean waiting hours for the next tide. Big delays, big costs.
So they might be like racing the tide in a way. Okay. And what about just schedules? Normal shipping schedules?
That's definitely another factor. Shipping is all about schedules. A tanker might be trying to make up time lost at a previous port. Weather delays, congestion, to get back on schedule for its next arrival slot. And then there's the economics of it, especially with time chartering.
Explain time chartering quickly.
Sure. It's basically where someone hires the ship for a set period. The faster that ship completes its voyages during that period, the more voyages it can potentially do, or the sooner it finishes its commitment.
Ah, so faster transit saves money.
It can, yes. Lower vessel hire costs per ton of cargo moved, potentially lower port fees if you spend less time waiting. So there's a definite financial incentive sometimes to, not dawdle.
Okay, efficiency pays. Now, this might sound a bit odd, but could going slightly faster actually help them steer these massive things sometimes?
That's a really good point, and yes, it can. It seems counterintuitive, maybe?
Yeah, a little.
But in certain situations, like navigating narrow channels or going around sharp bends, which you certainly have on rivers, a bit more speed actually improves the rudder's effectiveness. More water flowing faster over the rudder surface gives the ship better steering response. It helps stabilize it during a turn or when fighting, say, a strong cross current.
Huh. So going too slow could actually make it harder to control.
In some tight spots, yes. It can feel sluggish, less responsive, so maintaining adequate speed for maneuver is important.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've got load, tides, schedules, even maneuverability. What about just nature? The river current, the wind.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can't forget those. If the tanker is heading downstream, a strong river current will naturally add to its speed over the ground.
Like getting a free push.
Exactly. Same with the wind. A good tailwind, wind blowing from behind the ship, can also significantly increase its apparent speed without the engines actually working any harder.
Right, makes sense. Free speed is good speed.
Pretty much.
Okay, one last thought then. Could it just be us, our perception from the shore? Are these things just so huge they look faster than they are?
That's a very real possibility too. A perceptual illusion. Even if the tanker is well within the speed limit for the Longtau, which for big ships is typically around, say, 8 to 12 knots.
Which is about?
Roughly 9 to 14 miles per hour. Not exactly speeding.
Okay. Pretty sedate, actually.
Right. But because the vessel is so incredibly large, its movement across your field of vision can look deceptively fast compared to, say, a small boat moving at the same speed. It covers more ground relative to its size from your perspective.
Yeah, okay, I can see that. It's like watching a jumbo jet fly overhead. It looks slow, but it's doing hundreds of miles an hour. Same idea, but with size, making it look faster on the water.
Exactly, that principle, yes.
Yeah.
Relative scale and perspective.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together then. That tanker I saw in the Longtau River seeming a bit quick. It could have been running light or empty, meaning less drag, more speed potential.
Correct.
It might have been adjusting speed to catch the high tide just right for safe passage.
Very possible.
Schedule pressures, maybe making up time, or the economics of its charter agreement could be pushing it.
Another likely factor.
Then there's the slightly counterintuitive idea that a bit more speed might have been needed just then for better steering control in a tricky part of the river.
Yep, maneuverability.
Plus, it could have been getting a helpful shove from the river current or a tailwind.
Nature's boost.
And finally, it might just have looked fast to me because it's simply so enormous.
The perspective effect. Absolutely.
So really, it's likely a combination of these things rather than the ship just, flooring it.
Almost certainly. It's usually an interplay of several of these operational, environmental, and sometimes economic factors rather than just reckless speed.
Yeah.
Safety is paramount, always.
It really makes you appreciate the complexities, doesn't it? Something as seemingly straightforward as a ship moving down a river.
Has all these layers beneath it, the physics, the logistics, the environment, even how we see things. It kind of makes you wonder, what else do we see every day that seems simple, but actually has a whole lot more going on underneath?
That's a great takeaway. Always worth looking a little deeper, isn't it? Considering those unseen forces and needs.
Okay, picture this for a second. You're living your life by a river. Seems peaceful enough, right?
Yeah.
But then bit by bit, you actually watch your land just slide away into the water.
Yeah. That's a really unsettling thought, and it's the reality for people near the Longtau River in Ho Chi Minh City.
Exactly. And back in 2010, there was this big investment, something like 24 billion VND, put into a concrete seawall for the Kam Gia district. The whole idea was to stop that erosion,
And yet, even with what sounds like a pretty solid plan, the problem didn't just vanish. It's kind of amazing how much force-heavy cargo ship traffic can create. It causes ongoing damage, and you can imagine the fear for people living close by, especially when storms roll in.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We heard some tough stories. One person told us about losing coconut palms that were almost 100 years old, watching their house literally start to crack and lean towards the river.
Wow.
Yeah. And another resident, they're spending their own spare cash on rocks, just trying anything to hold back the water. And sadly, a lot of families have already had to move out.
It really underscores the sheer power of nature, doesn't it? And while fixing those seawalls is obviously one part of the puzzle, it got me thinking about the stuff you don't see. The foundational work that's so critical for riverside structures.
That's exactly where we're headed for this deep dive. Yeah. We're not just looking at the visible repairs. We're going deeper. Way down, actually, to the foundation specifically. This crucial process of driving concrete piles deep into the riverbed.
Ah, right.
Might not be glamorous, but it's literally the bedrock for keeping things stable. We're talking major bridges, ports, factories, even pumping stations that stop flooding.
Okay, let's unpack that then. Why exactly do you need to drive these huge concrete things into a riverbed? It sounds like a massive job.
Well, think about the ground right next to a river. Often it's really weak, waterlogged soil. It's almost like trying to build on, I don't know, wet sand that's always shifting.
Yeah, definitely not stable.
Right, it sinks, it erodes, it changes with the seasons. It's just not reliable for anything heavy.
And that's where pile driving comes in. It's quite clever, really. By hammering these strong concrete columns down through all that unstable muck, you're basically reaching down to find the solid, stable layers of soil much deeper underground. So the whole weight of whatever you're building gets transferred down there.
Like giving the structure really deep roots.
Exactly. Deep roots that go way past the surface issues.
And it's not just about stopping things from sinking, right? Rivers are dynamic places.
Oh, absolutely. You've got strong currents, pushing and pulling all the time, plus constant wetness, erosion. The foundations have to be incredibly tough.
Yeah, and resist corrosion too.
For sure. So a well-designed concrete pile foundation gives you that long-term strength. Think about bridge piers taking massive force or docks constantly in the water. Even things like hydroelectric plants or those drainage pumping stations we mentioned earlier, they all need that solid base.
Okay, so the why is pretty clear: stability in a challenging environment. Now let's get into the what. What kinds of concrete piles do they actually use for these river projects? I assume it's not just one standard type.
No, definitely not. Choosing the right pile is, it really depends on several things. You've got to look closely at the soil conditions, what's down there, clay, sand, rock. Then how much weight will the structure put on it? How deep is that good, solid soil? And, just the practical side, how feasible is it to actually install them in the water?
Makes sense. So what are some of the common ones we see?
Well, one very common type is the reinforced concrete square pile.
Okay.
These are usually pretty straightforward to install, cost-effective, strong enough for many jobs. You see them quite a bit.
And then you mentioned pre-stressed spun concrete piles. What makes them different?
These are sort of the high-performance option. They're made in a factory under really controlled conditions.
Right.
So they have incredibly high compressive strength. They can handle huge loads, and the quality control is excellent.
So for bigger projects, maybe?
Exactly. Big projects or ones with really heavy load requirements, they often go for these.
Gotcha. And you also touched on steel piles, sheet piles, or pipe piles. How do they fit in, since we're focusing on concrete?
Yeah, good question. Steel piles often play a really important, sometimes temporary support role. They're often used to build something called a cofferdam.
A cofferdam?
Yeah, imagine building a temporary watertight box or wall right there in the river.
Right.
It lets you pump the water out from inside that box, creating a dry work area.
I see. So you can work on the concrete piles more easily.
Precisely. It makes construction safer, gives you better quality control for the permanent concrete work. It's like building a temporary island.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, so we've got the why and the what. Let's get into the real action, the how. What's the actual process? Driving these huge things into a riverbed must be complex.
Oh, it absolutely is. It's way more than just banging concrete into the ground. It takes really careful planning and super precise execution every step of the way.
So walk us through it. What's the very first thing they need to do?
Before anything else, you need to know exactly what you're dealing with underwater. That means doing thorough geological and hydrological surveys.
Looking at the river flow, the soil layers.
Exactly. Checking the flow conditions, how much the riverbed might erode or scour, how deep the different soil layers go, and importantly, how strong that soil actually is.
So all that data basically tells them what kind of pile design they need.
Pretty much. It dictates the pile length, the diameter, the type of concrete mix needed to handle that specific environment. It's all based on that initial survey work.
Okay, survey done. Then what? Setting up on water sounds like a challenge itself.
It is. You can't just drive a truck out there. You need floating work platforms. These could be stable barges called pontoons, or sometimes even temporary bridges built out over the water.
Yeah, I guess keeping those platforms still is critical.
Absolutely crucial. They need really strong anchoring systems to stop them drifting with the current or being moved by passing boats. Stability is key.
Right, and then comes the big machinery.
Yep. Getting the heavy gear in place is the next big step. You're talking about crawler cranes and the pile driving hammers themselves. These could be vibratory hammers, which kind of shake the pile down, or diesel hammers, which use repeated impacts. The choice depends on the soil and the pile type.
And safety checks on all that equipment, I imagine.
Oh, definitely. Rigorous checks before anything starts moving.
Okay, platform stable, equipment ready. How does the actual driving work out there on the water?
Precision is everything. Each pile has to be positioned exactly where the plans say it should go, and keeping it perfectly vertical as it goes down is critical.
How do they track that?
They constantly monitor things like penetration resistance, how hard it is to push the pile deeper, also the number of hammer blows it takes, and how much the pile sinks with each blow. This real-time feedback ensures each pile gets down to the correct depth where it hits that strong, load-bearing soil.
And once it's in place, is that it? Or are there more checks?
Oh no, quality control doesn't stop there. It's vital. They do several post-installation checks. One method is called PDA, Pile Driving Analyzer.
PDA.
Yeah, it uses sensors during driving to do dynamic load tests, checking the pile's capacity. They might also use ultrasonic tests to find the exact top of the pile underwater. And of course, thorough visual inspections for any tilt or damage. You need to be sure it's right.
Wow, quite a process. It highlights the technical complexity for sure.
Right.
But what about the safety side? Working on water with heavy machinery must have unique risks.
That's a really important point. You've got the technical challenges, yes, but managing safety is a whole other layer, and it's absolutely critical in that kind of environment.
So what are the main safety headaches they have to manage?
Well, like we touched on, keeping those floating platforms stable is huge, especially with currents or boat traffic around. Those anchors have to be rock solid and checked constantly.
And the workers themselves?
Worker safety is paramount. Anyone on or near the water needs proper gear life vests, safety harnesses. Good lighting is essential if work happens at night, and everyone has to strictly follow drowning prevention rules.
And weather must be a big factor too.
Huge. Work has to stop immediately if conditions get bad. Heavy rain, strong winds, even big tide swings can be dangerous. You just don't take chances.
Sounds like very tight controls are needed. What about making sure the piles themselves stay solid over time?
The engineers are constantly checking things during installation, like keeping the piles vertical. They also monitor vibration levels and make sure all the piles are behaving consistently.
Because even a small tilt could cause problems later.
Exactly. A slight lean could create stress points, leading to cracks or even failure down the road. And then there's the long game fighting corrosion.
Right, being underwater constantly must be tough on the concrete.
It is. So often they use special high-grade concrete with waterproofing additives mixed in, or sometimes the piles get coated with protective layers like epoxy paint. These steps are really needed to make sure the piles last a long time, resisting the water and the currents.
Okay, so we've covered the process, the safety. Let's pull back a bit. What are the big picture pros and cons of doing all this complex work, driving piles in rivers?
Well, the number one advantage, the game changer really, is that ability to transfer the building's load down deep, down to that stable soil.
Which you just can't do with surface treatments on weak riverbanks.
Exactly. Surface fixes just don't cut it for long-term stability in those tricky soils. So pile driving becomes essential for building safely.
And it sounds pretty adaptable too.
Very versatile, yeah. It lets you build in all sorts of challenging river environments, small rivers, big busy ones, mangrove areas, even along the coast.
But it's not all smooth sailing, I guess. What are the main downsides?
Well, the technical difficulty is high. You need specialized, often very expensive equipment. You need workers with very specific skills, and you need really strict supervision the whole time.
It sounds expensive.
It definitely adds up. The cost is generally higher than other foundation methods, especially with the floating platforms, anchors, and fancy positioning gear needed.
Any other major challenges?
The environment itself. Working on a river means dealing with things like rainy seasons or big tides. That can cause delays and requires a lot of flexibility in how the site is managed.
So definitely complex, often costly, but sometimes absolutely necessary for safe, long-lasting structures in these environments.
Precisely. And it brings us right back to that eroding Longtau riverbank we started with. While seawalls are one approach, the kind of deep foundation work we discussed driving those strong piles down is often a more fundamental, more enduring solution for stability near water.
Yeah, it really is that unseen foundation holding so much up. It's essential for letting us build and live alongside these powerful rivers. It does make you think, doesn't it? With the ongoing need for development clashing with these forces of nature, how might new materials or cleverer techniques improve riverside structures even more, make them even more resilient against, growing environmental pressures? Definitely something interesting to consider for the future.